Fermented hot sauce is a great way to achieve that umami or savory flavor that everybody loves. This is a basic tutorial on how to make your first batch of fermented hot sauce. First, we'll go over the supplies that we need to make this sauce. To start, for the container, I like to use a 1 liter glass mason jar. Glass is great because it doesn't leach any flavor into your sauce. We also need a spring or some sort of a weight to hold everything down. We also need an airlock to go on top of our container. Now this one that I have right here is great because it came in a set with the spring, and it's also really small and doesn't take up a lot of space. There's plenty of other options out there, but I personally prefer this one. Next, I'll be going over the ingredients that I'm going to be using. I'll be using both orange and red bell peppers, a red onion, carrots, a couple cloves of garlic, and then both Apache and habanero peppers. Be sure to check the description of this video where I'll have a list of other popular ingredients that you can try out. Next, we have to create our brine, which is basically just a saltwater solution. I'm going to be using Himalayan pink salt, but you can just use regular salt as well. And then you also want to use unchlorinated water. In my case, I'm using distilled water. Now, if you live in the city and you don't have access to buying distilled water, you can also bring your water up to a boil and then let it cool, which will evaporate any chlorine that could be left in it. You also need to get a scale to measure out your salt weight. If you don't have access to a scale, you can also use about 4 tablespoons of salt per liter of water, which gets to about a 3.5% brine. Next, we'll cut up our ingredients. I like to start with the smallest ingredients first, which in my case is garlic. After it's cut up, add that garlic to the jar. Next, I'm going to cut up my peppers. Make sure to de-seed your peppers because seeds have a nasty habit of floating to the top, which can leave your ferment in a greater risk of growing mold. Next, I'm going to cut up my bell peppers. Again, make sure to remove the seeds. After my peppers, I'm going to cut up my carrots. Like I mentioned before, I like to layer my jar with smallest items on bottom and biggest items on top because it helps to prevent things from floating. Next, I'm going to cut up my onion. I cut my onion into a thin slice, which will help assist my weight in pushing everything down. I also poked a hole out into the center of the onion, which will help release any gas that could be trapped underneath. I like to keep my onion roughly the same size as my jar, because it'll help prevent any items from floating up to the surface. Make sure you have roughly ½ inch to 1 inch of room left in the top of the jar. Next, we'll create our brine using water and salt. Now, we want to aim for about a 2 to 5% salt weight to water ratio, I guess. So what I mean by that is if you have 100 grams of water, you want to use anywhere from 2 to 5 grams of salt, because it's a weight percentage and not a volume percentage. Like I mentioned earlier, if you don't have a scale to measure out your weights, you can also use approximately 4 tablespoons of salt per liter of water, which gets you right around a 3.5% brine. To measure out our water, we're going to set our container that we're going to measure it in on the scale, and we're going to zero out our scale, and then set our units to grams. Next, we're going to pour water into the container. I'm going to bring our water right to 1,000 grams, so 1 liter of water. This will make my calculations a lot easier for the salt. Once we hit 1,000 grams exactly, we're going to switch this container out for a smaller container that we will be using to measure the salt. I like my stuff not too salty, so we're going to aim for about a 3% brine. So 3% of 1,000 is 30, so we're going to aim for 30 grams of salt. We ended up getting 31, so we will have a 3.1% brine. After you've measured your salt, add it into the water. And then we're going to put a lid on this container and shake it up for a minute or two until all that salt is dissolved. Once your salt's dissolved, we'll pour it into our jar. When you're pouring it, make sure to leave a little over half an inch of room, because what could happen is as your sauce is fermenting, it could produce a little bit of gas, which could overflow the jar if there's not enough airspace. After you've added your salt water, you want to take your spring or your weight and push everything down. Now, this is a great time to make sure you don't have any floaters. So if any of your ingredients that you cut up in there are floating, now's the best time to either remove it or push it down so it won't be in the way. Anything that's floating could potentially mold, which is not good at all. Remember the rule, below the brine, you're fine. So basically, if you're below the water level, you're fine and you're not going to get any mold. Carefully place the lid on top, and once again, check your ferment to make sure that you don't have any floaters. If you do, now's the best time to remove them. Once your ferment started, you're not going to want to remove your lid again, because introducing additional oxygen into the mix could compromise your ferment. After your lid's on tight and everything's in place, you want to find a nice dark cabinet or closet to store your ferment. Make sure to store it out of light because light could introduce algae growth, which is not good. You'll want to store your ferment at room temperature for a very minimum of 2 weeks. Now, the longer you store your ferment, the more complex the flavor will be. I've known people that have stored their ferment for up to 3 years. In this case, I'll be storing it for about a month. Check back in about 1 month to see part 2 of this video. Thank you all for watching. Bye.